Listen closely because what I'm about to walk you through could genuinely change the way you understand and handle a toxic relationship. If you've ever felt like your reality was being twisted, like your energy was being drained day after day, like every conversation somehow ended with you questioning yourself, your intentions, your memories, or even your own sanity, I want you to hear this clearly. Confusion is often a signal, not a weakness. You are not automatically too sensitive. You are not automatically overreacting. And you are not the only person who has experienced that strange emotional fog where you walk away from a conversation feeling exhausted, guilty, and unsure of what just happened. Sometimes the hardest relationships to understand are not the ones filled with obvious conflict. They are the ones where the damage happens quietly. The ones where words are rearranged, emotions are dismissed, and responsibility seems to disappear into thin air. You start entering conversations with a simple thought, but somehow you leave carrying a burden that was never yours to carry. What you're picking up on has a name in psychology: projection. Projection is a defense mechanism where a person unconsciously places their own uncomfortable thoughts, emotions, insecurities, fears, or unresolved conflicts onto someone else. Instead of facing a painful part of themselves, they transfer that feeling outward. The internal storm becomes someone else's problem. Imagine someone carrying a heavy backpack filled with shame, fear, insecurity, and unresolved wounds. Instead of opening that backpack and examining what is inside, they hand it to another person and say, "This belongs to you." Suddenly, you find yourself defending yourself against accusations that reveal more about their inner world than yours. They may accuse you of being selfish when they are struggling with their own selfish behavior. They may call you controlling when they feel uncomfortable with losing control. They may accuse you of being dishonest because facing their own dishonesty feels unbearable. They may describe you as the problem because accepting their own role in the relationship would require painful self-reflection. Projection creates a psychological illusion. The person experiencing the projection may begin looking inward and asking, "Am I really like this? Did I really do something wrong? Maybe I am the problem." And that is where the emotional trap begins. A healthy relationship allows two people to examine their behavior. If one person hurts the other, there should be space for accountability, understanding, and repair. But in unhealthy dynamics, accountability can feel like a threat. The person who refuses to face their own wounds may attempt to protect their self-image by creating a different story where someone else becomes responsible. The closer you are to someone, the more likely you may become the target of their projection. Why? Because closeness creates emotional exposure. The people nearest to us often see the parts of ourselves we try hardest to hide. A stranger may never notice our insecurities, fears, or contradictions, but a partner, family member, or close friend often sees behind the curtain. For someone who has built their identity around appearing perfect, powerful, or always right, being truly seen can feel threatening. Instead of saying, "I feel insecure," they may say, "You make me feel insecure." Instead of saying, "I am afraid of being rejected," they may say, "You are abandoning me." Instead of saying, "I made a mistake," they may say, "You forced me into this." The painful part is that projection is often convincing because it is delivered with emotion. A person can sincerely express anger, disappointment, or hurt while still misplacing the source of those feelings. Intensity does not always equal truth. Someone can feel something deeply and still misunderstand where that feeling comes from. This is one of the most important lessons when dealing with emotionally unhealthy relationships. Someone's emotional reaction is information, but it is not always evidence. If someone is angry at you, that does not automatically mean you harmed them. If someone feels disappointed in you, that does not automatically mean you failed them. If someone labels you as the villain, that does not automatically mean you are one. You have to look at patterns, facts, behaviors, and reality, not only emotional explosions. Many people caught in toxic dynamics experience something called self-doubt conditioning. Over time, repeated criticism, blame shifting, or emotional confusion can train a person to distrust their own perception. At first, you may challenge the accusation. You might say, "That isn't what happened." You might explain your intentions, you might provide evidence, but if every conversation ends with you apologizing for things you did not do, eventually your mind starts searching for ways to prevent conflict. You begin editing yourself. You become careful with your words. You analyze every message before sending it. You replay conversations in your head. You wonder how something so simple became so complicated. This is emotionally exhausting because your brain is constantly trying to solve a problem that has no logical solution. You are trying to find the perfect explanation, the perfect sentence, or the perfect behavior that will finally make the other person understand. But when someone is committed to protecting their own distorted version of reality, your perfect explanation may never arrive. The issue is not always that you have failed to communicate. Sometimes the issue is that the other person is unwilling to receive what you are communicating. This is why boundaries become so important. A boundary is not a punishment. It is not revenge. It is not an attempt to control another person. A boundary is a statement about what you will and will not participate in. For example, I am willing to discuss this when we can both speak respectfully. I will not continue a conversation where I am being insulted. I understand you feel upset, but I do not accept responsibility for something I did not do. These statements do not attack the other person. They protect your emotional space. People who benefit from your confusion may not appreciate your clarity. When you stop automatically accepting blame, the entire relationship dynamic can shift. The old pattern no longer works. The emotional cycle begins to break. This is often when you discover something important. Some people do not want resolution as much as they want emotional control. Resolution requires two people looking honestly at the situation. Control requires one person dominating the narrative. When you stop defending yourself endlessly, you remove the fuel that keeps certain unhealthy patterns alive. Another important aspect of projection is understanding the wounded self behind it. Many people who project are not consciously thinking, I will now manipulate this person. Human psychology is more complicated than that. People often develop defenses because at some point in their lives, those defenses help them survive emotionally. A person who grew up in an environment where mistakes were punished harshly may become terrified of admitting fault. A person who experienced rejection may become obsessed with protecting themselves from feeling rejected again. A person who learned that vulnerability was unsafe may attack others before they feel exposed. Understanding this does not mean excusing harmful behavior. Compassion and boundaries can exist together. You can understand why someone behaves a certain way while still deciding that their behavior is damaging to you. You can recognize someone's wounds without allowing those wounds to become your responsibility. One of the biggest mistakes people make in toxic relationships is believing that if they love someone enough, explain enough, sacrifice enough, or prove themselves enough, they can heal the other person's unresolved pain. But another person's inner work cannot be completed by your exhaustion. You cannot build someone's self-worth by destroying your own. You cannot create emotional safety by constantly abandoning yourself. You cannot bring peace into a relationship where only one person is trying to create it. The turning point comes when you stop asking, how do I make them finally understand me? And you begin asking, why am I continuing to ignore what this experience is showing me? That question changes everything. Because healing often begins when you return to your own reality. Your feelings matter, your memories matter, your perspective matters. You are allowed to pause and ask, does this accusation actually match my behavior? Am I taking responsibility for something that belongs to someone else? Do I feel respected in this relationship? Am I becoming smaller just to keep the peace? These questions are not acts of selfishness. They are acts of self-awareness. The goal is not to become cold, angry, or disconnected from everyone. The goal is to become grounded. Because there is a big difference between emotional protection and emotional shutdown. When someone has experienced a relationship where their feelings were constantly dismissed, their reality was questioned, or their kindness was repeatedly taken advantage of, it can become tempting to build a wall around themselves. They may think, if I never trust anyone again, nobody can hurt me. They may believe that becoming distant, unavailable, or emotionally numb is the only way to stay safe. But that is not healing. That is simply another form of being controlled by the pain. True healing does not mean closing your heart. It means learning how to hold your heart with wisdom. Being grounded means you no longer allow every emotion, accusation, or reaction from another person to pull you away from yourself. You can listen without absorbing everything. You can care without carrying someone else's emotional weight. You can understand another person's perspective without abandoning your own. A grounded person does not need to prove their worth in every conversation. They do not feel forced to defend every detail of their character whenever someone misunderstands them. They have an internal sense of stability that says, I know who I am, I know what I value, I know what I experienced. This does not mean they never make mistakes. Grounded people can apologize, they can reflect, they can admit when they are wrong. But the difference is that they do not accept false responsibility just to escape conflict. They understand that accountability and self-blame are not the same thing. Accountability says, I can look at my actions honestly and improve. Self-blame says, everything must somehow be my fault because someone is upset with me. Grounding allows you to separate facts from emotional pressure. For example, someone might say, you never care about me. A person who is not grounded may immediately panic. They may start listing everything they have done, trying desperately to convince the other person that they are loving enough. But a grounded person pauses. They ask themselves, is this statement accurate? Is this about my behavior? Or is this about their emotional state? Is there something I need to repair? Or am I being pulled into defending myself against an unfair accusation? That pause is powerful. That small moment between a trigger and a reaction is where personal freedom begins. Grounded people learn that they do not have to attend every emotional battle they are invited into. Some conversations are designed to create understanding. Others are designed to create confusion. The difference is often found in whether both people are willing to be honest. A healthy conversation sounds like, "I felt hurt when this happened. Can we talk about it?" An unhealthy conversation often sounds like, "You hurt me, therefore everything is your fault." One invites connection. The other creates a courtroom where one person is always the defendant. Being grounded means stepping out of that courtroom. It means realizing that your peace does not depend on winning every argument. Sometimes the most powerful response is not another explanation. Sometimes it is simply recognizing that you have already explained enough. When you become grounded, you also stop confusing intensity with love. Many people who have experienced unhealthy relationships become accustomed to emotional chaos. Constant highs and lows can feel like passion. Arguments followed by apologies can feel like closeness. The cycle of tension and relief can create a powerful emotional attachment. But groundedness teaches you to recognize that love does not have to feel like a constant emotional emergency. Healthy love has room to breathe. It allows two people to disagree without destroying each other. It allows mistakes without humiliation. It allows honesty without fear. To know the difference between healthy accountability and misplaced guilt, healthy accountability says, "I made a mistake and I can grow." Unhealthy guilt says, "I must be the problem because someone else refuses to look at themselves." Those are two completely different experiences. When you understand projection, you begin seeing relationships through a clearer lens. You stop automatically accepting every accusation as truth. You stop confusing someone else's emotional storm with your own identity. You begin realizing that sometimes the person accusing you of being lost is actually struggling to face themselves. And sometimes the person telling you that you are the problem is simply uncomfortable because you are no longer willing to carry the problem for them. Your peace begins when you stop fighting battles that were never yours. Your clarity begins when you stop letting someone else's unresolved pain become your personal identity. And your freedom begins when you understand this powerful truth. You can care about someone deeply and still refuse to become the place where they deposit everything they refuse to heal. You can love someone and still choose yourself. You can understand someone's wounds and still protect your own heart. Because at the end of the day, a healthy relationship should not require you to lose your connection with reality just to maintain a connection with another person. And today, I want to walk you through one sentence, just one, that tends to stop a narcissist cold and makes them genuinely wary of you going forward. But here's the catch, and I mean this seriously. Once you understand the psychology behind this, you can't unsee it. There's no going back to being manipulated the way you were before. So let me ask you honestly, are you ready for that kind of clarity? Because it changes things. Here's the first thing you need to sit with. Narcissistic behavior was never actually about you. It's about a person's unconscious terror of ever having to face their own shadow side, the parts of themselves they've spent a lifetime refusing to look at. What we often see clinically is something like an inflated sense of self, a psychological defense that exists specifically to mask a much deeper well of emptiness and shame underneath. And here's the part that trips people up. Narcissists are frequently drawn toward empathetic, self-reflective people, the exact opposite of who they are, not by accident, because those qualities represent everything they've disowned in themselves. There's a pattern worth naming here. People with narcissistic traits tend to seek out their own psychological opposite, someone carrying the very qualities they've banished into their own shadow. Real empathy, honest self-reflection, emotional depth they can't access in themselves. Why would they be drawn to that instead of repelled by it? Because being near you forces them, even unconsciously, to confront everything they've lost touch with in themselves, and that is deeply threatening. So instead of sitting with that discomfort, they project their inner chaos outward onto you. Here's what matters, though. The moment you actually understand this dynamic for what it is, the balance of power shifts. Keep listening, because I want to show you exactly how understanding this exposes their deepest fear. A lot of narcissistic behavior comes down to an overwhelming, almost desperate need to protect a false mask, whatever the cost. There are 3 drives underneath that behavior worth naming clearly. First, control, which exists to avoid ever facing their own shadow. Second, validation, which keeps their inflated sense of self propped up. And third, confusion, which they use to keep people from ever seeing who they actually are underneath it all. Control tends to function as their core survival mechanism. They need to control your perception, your emotions, your version of reality, because your authentic self, just by existing near them, threatens to expose the mask they're wearing. What research on personality patterns like this shows again and again is that people with these traits often live with a constant low-grade terror of being truly seen. That's the real reason behind so much of the reality bending and manipulation, not strength, fear. Their hunger for validation isn't confidence either, even though it looks that way from the outside. It's closer to a kind of compensatory inflation, propping up something that feels deflated and fragile underneath. They don't crave admiration because it feels good. They crave it because without it, they're forced to face the collapse waiting underneath their shadow. Every compliment functions like a temporary patch on a wound that's never actually been allowed to heal. But maybe the most unsettling piece of all of this is how deliberately confusion gets used as a tool. It's not accidental fog, it's manufactured fog. The lines between reality and manipulation get blurred on purpose because a confused person is so much easier to control than a clear one. They want you doubting your own perceptions because your clarity is the single biggest threat to everything they're maintaining. Stick with me here, because what actually breaks this cycle is going to surprise you. The real key to breaking free from this kind of manipulation comes down to something you could call conscious withdrawal, deliberately pulling your energy back from feeding whatever it is they're hungry for. And what they're hungry for, essentially, is your unconscious participation, your emotional reactions, your desperate explanations, your need to be understood by someone who was never actually capable of understanding you the way you needed. When you argue with a narcissist, understand this. You're not having a rational conversation, no matter how much it might feel like one in the moment. You're feeding exactly the thing they're starving for. Every tear, every defensive explanation, every moment you spend confused is, to them, confirmation that the manipulation is landing. This creates a kind of psychological entanglement where you start becoming absorbed into their distorted version of events, almost without noticing it happening. But here's the encouraging part. The moment you reach what we could call conscious detachment, their grip starts to loosen. And I want to be clear, this isn't about going numb or shutting down emotionally. It's closer to a kind of grounded clarity, where you can see their behavior for exactly what it is without getting emotionally hijacked by it every single time. Firm, conscious detachment means you simply stop participating in the drama. You can observe the manipulation tactics without absorbing them into your own sense of reality. You can witness the projection landing on you without internalizing it as truth. And this drives a narcissist toward real desperation because they genuinely need your unconscious participation to keep their inflated sense of self intact. Here's maybe the single most important thing to understand in all of this. A narcissist cannot survive someone else's psychological independence. The moment you stop chasing their validation, stop over-explaining yourself, stop trying to get them to finally understand your truth, you become someone they simply can't manipulate anymore because you're no longer available for it. Now here's the sentence I promised you, the one that speeds all of this up. Are you ready to hear it? It's simple. Almost disappointingly simple. I'm not available for this conversation. That's it. And I want to explain exactly why this lands the way it does. This phrase doesn't attack their ego. It doesn't trigger a defensive spiral. It doesn't hand them any new ammunition to twist and use against you later. What it does instead is create a boundary they genuinely cannot get around because it denies them the one thing they need most from you, your participation in their version of reality. A lot of narcissistic dynamics run on what you could call circular entanglement, conversations that never actually go anywhere, but that quietly drain your energy and your sense of stability the longer they continue. But when you say, "I'm not available for this conversation," you're doing something quietly radical. You're withdrawing your energy from the whole exchange entirely. That's conscious non-participation, and it tends to be one of the things a narcissist fears the most, whether they could ever put words to that fear or not. Why does it land so hard? Because narcissistic behavior depends on your emotional engagement to keep the inflated self-image running. Without that engagement, they're left facing the exact emptiness they've spent their entire lives running from. This sentence works precisely because there's nothing in it to argue with, twist, or manipulate. It isn't an attack, so they can't play the victim in response to it. It isn't an explanation, so there's nothing there for them to confuse or gaslight you about. It's just a boundary, plain and simple. And healthy boundaries like that tend to be exactly what this kind of manipulation can't survive contact with. Here's a fair warning, though. At first, things usually get worse before they get better. Stay with me, because I want you to understand why that escalation is actually a sign that what you're doing is working. When someone with these patterns senses they're losing psychological control over you, they'll often ramp up their tactics for a while rather than back off. You might get accused of being cold, distant, avoidant, emotionally unavailable, all the things that once might have made you second guess yourself. But that reaction isn't proof that you're doing something wrong. It's proof that the boundary is actually holding. This escalation tends to happen because you've disrupted a kind of psychological balance they depend on to keep their false self propped up. When you stop participating in the drama, they experience something close to a quiet panic, the terror of finally having to face their own wounded, unfiltered self without you there to distract from it. But here's what tends to happen with consistency over time. You start reclaiming your own sense of authentic power. Every single time you calmly repeat some version of, "I'm not available for this conversation," you reinforce your own independence a little more. Eventually, most people with these patterns realize they can't get through this particular boundary no matter what they try. They might switch tactics, come at it from a different angle, try charm instead of pressure, but your consistent refusal to engage breaks the hook they've relied on to keep pulling you back into their distorted version of things. This sentence is more than just words, honestly. It functions almost like a quiet declaration of sovereignty over your own mind. You're essentially telling them, without needing to explain or justify it, that your energy is no longer available for their chaos, their manipulation, or the way they've been feeding off your reactions. And that tends to be deeply unsettling for them because it forces a confrontation with their real fear, which was never actually about losing you specifically. It's about losing their ability to avoid their own shadow by pulling someone else into managing it for them. Here's the piece that I think matters most, and it might change how you think about all of this going forward. When you maintain a boundary like this consistently over time, you end up somewhere really valuable. You become someone who simply can't be destabilized by another person's projections anymore. And that transformation doesn't just protect you from one difficult relationship. It tends to make you far less vulnerable to this kind of dynamic in general, because you develop a kind of pattern recognition, an ability to spot manipulation and projection early, before it ever gets the chance to hook into you the way it used to. People who genuinely master this kind of boundary become exactly what someone with narcissistic patterns fears most: a target who simply isn't available anymore. Not someone to drain, not someone to confuse, not someone to control. You reclaim something that's genuinely yours, your own sense of psychological authority over your own life. And here's maybe the most important thing of all. This sentence doesn't just change how a narcissist experiences you, it changes how you experience yourself. Every time you honor a boundary like this, you strengthen your own sense of self, the version of you that can't be talked out of your own reality by someone else's chaos. Real freedom in situations like this was never really about changing the other person. It comes from making yourself unavailable for their projections in the first place. When you actually master this quiet, consistent non-participation, you don't just manage to escape the manipulation, you move past needing to manage it at all. This is really how you take your power back. One boundary, one sentence, one conscious choice at a time. The tactics that once worked so well against you stop working entirely against someone who has simply stopped playing the game. You don't need to outsmart, expose, or win against someone like this. You just need to become someone they can no longer manipulate. And that, more than any argument you could ever win, is what actually makes them wary of you for good. Not your anger, your steadiness, not your arguments, your quiet refusal to engage, not your reaction, your complete unwillingness to keep participating in a reality that was never true to begin with. Once you really understand that, you've already won, whether they ever admit it or not.